Welcome explorers. Today, dive into the thrilling TTP narration of Hunting with Predators by Banancake, a 25-part fan-made saga from the Nature of Predators series by Spacepaladin15 on r/HFY.
Memory transcription subject, Vickery, the honey badger. Date, standardized human time, October 31, 2136, 14 days after the Battle of Earth. In all my time in the wilderness, I'd never been so captivated by the snow. It sparkled in unpredictable ways, reflecting sunlight at any angle I could imagine. It never stayed the same. As I sat, I watched a small area on the ground in front of me. Tiny fractals would glisten in the sun, only to vanish moments later as the snow melted and caused every flake around it to shift. Scale this up to a few million snowflakes, and you get a mesmerizing glistening effect. Always changing. It was surreal. Just minutes ago, I was overcome with grief. The fur near my eyes was still matted down with slowly freezing tears. Now, I just felt numb. Tenga's corpse was mere inches away, covered over by a blanket. The same one that Querek and I huddled in together when we first decided that the humans should hunt. The same one that kept Querek warm while Tenga and the others carried him for untold miles. None of us ever even bothered to ask where it came from. It was obvious it didn't come from an escape pod. It was too ornate. It was a light tan color with an elaborate diamond pattern in the center of varying colors, mostly red. Surrounding it were the shapes of an array of earth animals in the same shade of red. There were deer, birds of prey, and even bison sewn around the edges. I thought that perhaps it was handmade. Despite that, my mind dwelled mostly on the ground in front of me. It was as if my brain simply couldn't process everything that was happening. It was too much emotion to handle, so my mind entirely blocked it out and dwelled on meaningless things. The others weren't far. Grant, Reese, and Querek were conversing with Foster just a dozen or so steps away. They'd spoken to me, but I couldn't remember what they'd said. In the last 20 minutes, I hadn't moved from that spot. At some point, I'd stopped paying attention to everything happening around me. I was stuck. I couldn't muster the will to move. I couldn't summon the energy to feel. I heard footsteps approaching. I'd hoped those three had resigned to leave me be, but it seemed I was wrong. Vickery? I slowly lifted my head and saw Sigra standing in front of me. Foster stood with her arms crossed a few steps behind her. The Gojid shifted nervously as my eyes met hers. She averted my gaze before looking down in front of her. She choked before composing herself. I'm sorry, he was a better person than most Gojids I've met. I hung my head once again. I'm sorry. I should have just... She gave up trying to finish her sentence, wheeled around, and started walking back toward the prisoners. She called him a person. Curiosity boiled in the back of my mind, the first thought of any significance to surface for what felt like an eternity. I looked up. Sigra. My voice was thoroughly ruined. The smoke, screaming, and sobbing had overtaxed my vocal cords to the point that it was painful to speak in anything but a near whisper. The Gojid turned toward me. Yes. Do you regret it? What do you? Tenga said he thought you regretted what you did. He was never wrong about those kinds of things. I interrupted. The Gojid turned around slowly and took a few steps back toward me. Well, it's like he said. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought the humans were responsible for the destruction of my home. That's what everyone told me. That was the only thing they told me. She took another step forward, weaving her claws together timidly. All I was concerned with was the numbers on a screen. Data. I never thought a predator could be like him. I thought I was fighting monsters, but looking back, I was the monster. Her spines extended slightly, apparently in response to hearing herself say that. And now I have to live with that for the rest of my life. She looked down at the ground. The humans I've met have defied every expectation I once had. Tenga especially. Her voice drifted in the wind as she looked down at Tenga's body. I'm still terrified of them, and I'm still not convinced that some of them don't want to kill me. She looked back at the group of soldiers standing guard around the prisoners. But I don't think they deserve to die because of it. So, yes. I regret it. I just wish there was something I could do about it. That was one thing I was relieved not to have on my conscience. To know that I'd played a part in taking irreplaceable lives. Had first contact with the humans not gone the way it did, the Venlil could have been part of that extermination fleet. I could have been the one in Sigra's place. I rubbed my head as I looked back down at the ground. Right again, then, I muttered. Sigra paused. Yeah. She stood there for a moment, unsure what to do. I overheard the humans talking about the Arxer coming here. What do you think they'll do? She asked nervously. I took a deep breath. Nothing good. You should probably stay with the group. The humans shouldn't let them do anything to you. What about you? I'm staying right here. Grant approached from behind, and Sigra flinched slightly, backing out of the way. Grant squinted. Shouldn't you be with the others? Sigra backed away. Yes. I was on my way over there. Grant nodded. Go on then. Sigra hastily marched back toward the group of prisoners against the ship. There were somewhere between 20 and 30, surrounded by soldiers who never took their eyes off them. Much of the crying and pleading had died down. Instead, many of the crocodiles seemed defeated. Resigned to the fate they thought was coming. Grant dusted the snow off a pistol in his hand, the same one Tenga had tucked in his waistband. He knelt down and placed it on the lieutenant's chest before sitting on the opposite side of him. He crossed his legs, laying the rifle over them. He fidgeted for a moment before speaking. Are you sure you want to stay here? I never looked over at him, but I swallowed a breath and nodded. Grant sighed. Then I guess I will too. Don't want to leave you here alone when the Arxer get here. You think they'll try to eat me? I don't know what they're gonna do. I'm really not sure why they're even helping us. I wondered what it would be like to meet the Arxer face to face. I'd heard plenty of stories. It was no mystery to me that they were monsters, but if the humans were working with them, maybe that was only the case with herbivores like me. I knew this wouldn't go smoothly, but it took far too much energy to rack my brain over it. I was spent. A few more minutes passed before I heard engines in the distance. 2 spacecraft appeared over the tree line. They were large, armored shuttles with an assortment of weaponry mounted to them. They stopped just above the trees as everyone watched with anticipation. The cold air swirled underneath them, lifting a cloud of snow and small debris from the ground. The vessels were eerily silent. A deep, thrumming drone accompanied by the sound of billowing jets of fire emanated from the engines, but not much else. The prisoners recognized the design immediately. They watched in horror as the ships slowly approached closer. Grant and I were behind the main group relative to the shuttles, with the destroyer and prisoners on our right. The ships were far too big to land between the trees. Instead, ropes were let down from a large bay on one side, landing just meters away from Foster and her men. Moments later, 5 figures rappelled down simultaneously, landing in the snow with a thud. They were bigger than I'd imagined. Their large, bulky frames made the humans look slender and short in comparison. Their thick, gray scales were obscured by the gear they carried. They wore what looked like some sort of heated inner layer, keeping the reptilians from freezing in Earth's harsh conditions. They held large, bulky weapons, which they gripped tight as they scanned their surroundings. Most of them locked their eyes on the large group of prisoners against the ship. A look crawled over their faces that I could only assume was hunger and amusement. They walked in a loose formation behind one Arxer in the front. He was noticeably larger than the rest. He walked with a noticeably more relaxed posture compared to his comrades. The icon of the fear that gripped the entire Federation for generations was just meters away from me. As they approached the group of humans, uneasiness was evident from both parties. The humans seemed to almost instinctively fan out, forming a wide, half-circle around the group of Arxer. The reptilians darted their eyes between them warily, clearly put off by the humans' preemptive maneuver to surround them. It was the same tactic the wolves used. It was like watching two predators size each other up. The Arxer at the front of the group stopped a few feet from Foster. He looked around briefly before speaking in a guttural tone. "Who is in charge here?" Foster shuffled slightly. "That would be me. I could have guessed. You seem to be the center of this formation." The reptilian chuckled slightly as he scanned over the humans around him. "My name is Rawlise. I am in charge of our rescue efforts in this region. We came expecting a fight, but it seems you've managed without us." The Arxer looked over to the group of prisoners against the ship, every one of which was frozen in terror. "And secured quite the catch as well. I'm impressed. I'm Commander Foster. All the dirty work is done, I'm afraid. But we could still use a ride out of here," Foster said plainly. Her posture was stiff, as was the case for all of the humans. Rawlise stood slightly straighter. Let's have a look then." He turned to his left and approached the destroyer, walking up to the edge of the humans' reflexive formation. With his soldiers behind him, he stopped in front of one of Foster's men. The human looked up at the taller-than-average Arxer but stayed put, gripping his rifle tight. Rawlise looked down. His eyes creased slightly before he leaned closer to the human's face. "Excuse me." Rawlise blew air from his nostrils, forming a dense cloud of vapor around the human's concealed face. The human's eyes darted to the commander, who nodded slightly. The human once again locked his eyes on the Arxers before slowly stepping to the side. Rawlise straightened again and walked toward the prisoners, surveying them curiously. "What do you plan to do with this prize?" Foster walked up next to him, keeping at a safe distance. "We prefer the term, prisoners of war, but we'll hand them over into UN custody. Maybe they can get some intelligence out of them. Anything after that really isn't my call." "Curious. I assumed by their condition that you'd plan to keep them for yourselves." Rawlise turned toward the group of humans. "Are you not angry about what they did to your planet?" The humans were silent before Reese spoke up from close to the rear. "Of course we are. But we have rules." The Arxer scoffed. "Only humans would assign rules to something as chaotic as warfare. This is why I say you're too soft." "So much," he snarled. "Mercy, losing 1 billion of your people is not a time to be merciful. I assure you these savages will not return it in kind." The humans looked at each other as they shifted. Foster looked up at Rawlise. "1 billion?" The Arxer turned to her and exhaled, his breath forming a cloud in front of his face. "Yes. The UN estimated that 1 billion humans are dead. Many, many more are missing or injured. The list of destroyed cities is extensive." Beside me, Grant turned around and walked a few steps before squatting down, propping himself up with his rifle as he held his mouth with one hand. I couldn't see his face, but I could hear his ragged breaths as he hung his head. It sounded like he was on the verge of vomiting. The numbness I felt began to melt away, replaced with empathy. My mind just couldn't comprehend the scale of the death and destruction that Earth endured. I knew it was bad. But this was worse than I imagined. Rawlise turned back toward the prisoners. "That being said, we will help you. That's why we've been stuck here for the past 2 weeks, after all. And because we've been stuck here, we've been going a bit hungry." He paced in front of the group of prisoners. "I think a small cut of your prize in exchange for our help is only fair. We saved your planet, after all. Without us, these prey would never have stopped at just 1 billion. He got down on all fours, just in front of Sigra and Flen. They both pinned their backs even tighter against the ship. Rawlise sniffed the air a couple of times before laughing lightly. "It's been especially long since I've had Gojid." My tail whipped around violently as I stood up. I was trying to let the humans handle this, but I was not about to watch this monster insult and undo the very thing my friend died to achieve. I felt a fury burning in my chest, unlike anything I'd ever felt. Mixed within it was primal fear begging me to sit back down. Foster and her men moved toward the Arxer simultaneously, but it was too late. I shouted out in a pathetic, raspy voice. Leave them alone. Rawleyes stood up, turned to me, and snarled, "So you brought your pets too? Interesting." He let out a low rumble as he started walking towards me. "You should really teach them when not to speak." My heart picked up the pace as my raspy breathing quickened. In the corner of my vision, I saw Grant walk up beside me, his rifle at low ready and his eyes glassed over. "Best keep your claws to yourself," he growled. "Oh, that won't be an issue. I'm not so indecent that I'd damage a fellow hunter's property." The Arxer stopped in front of me. He was more massive than I'd realized. His yellow eyes gazed down into mine, obscured by the fog rising from the predator's snout. I was trembling. My legs felt like they might give out. A flood of chemicals washed through my body as my eyes widened. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I stood my ground. I'd learned this lesson already. The Arxer leaned down, squinting his eyes at me. It was clear he'd expected me to be halfway into the forest by now. I fell backward, bumping into Tenga's corpse and knocking the sidearm into the snow beside me. Grant stood close by, gripping his rifle tight. "He's no pet," the human growled. Rawleyes snorted. "Are you sure? Judging by the fact he hasn't fled already, this must be his master." He reached a claw out toward the blanket. What happened to I'd never felt my body move so quickly. The snow shifted all at once as everyone in the forest raised their weapons. A mass standoff ensued under the pines in the blink of an eye. Yelps and whines sounded from the prisoners as they lay in the snow, attempting to shield themselves with their bound limbs. My chest rose and fell with long, heavy breaths. My legs trembled as I stood, my face right next to Rawleyes' sharp, dagger-like teeth. Below his menacing jaws, a pistol was pressed firmly into his chin, held tight in my shaking paws. I panted. "Touch him, and I'll kill you," I hissed. The Arxer's eyes went from an aggressive squint to wide open as they tracked onto mine. "Oh, here we fucking go," Reese groaned as he stood in front of Querek. At the edge of my vision to my left, I noticed an Arxer with a rifle leveled at me. "Drop the weapon, food." To my right, I noticed Grant aiming at the same Arxer. "You dropped the weapon." Foster stood in the middle of the chaos. "Let's just all put our weapons down. We're all on the same team whether we like it or not." I refuse to be on the same team as these monsters. I shouted. "Vic, stand down." "That's an order." "That won't be necessary, Commander," Rawleyes said calmly. His eyes narrowed as he stared at me for a moment. "My soldiers, stand down." One of the Arxer soldiers wheeled around. "What?" "Stand down." Rawleyes roared. The Arxer soldiers exchanged glances before they hesitantly lowered their weapons. The humans followed suit. Rawleyes surveyed my expression, primarily my eyes, before he spoke. "Are you afraid?" I took in a deep breath. My head felt like it was going more and more numb the longer the predator's eyes were locked onto me. I took a ragged breath. "I'm terrified." The Arxer paused for a moment. "But you meant it." The Arxer gazed into my eyes for a few more seconds. He chuckled. "Fascinating." Without another word, he stood up, turned his back to me, and walked away, leaving me standing there with a gun in my paws. He casually walked past Foster as he spoke. "Very well, keep your prisoners. We will let the UN know you're here. Clearly, things will go much more smoothly without us here." Everyone seemed confused, especially the Arxer. "Back to the ship. All of you." The soldiers glanced at each other in bewilderment but didn't question Rawleyes' order. They held tight to the lines dangling from the ship silently hovering overhead. I heard one of them ask, "So we aren't taking any cattle?" Rawleyes rumbled. "No. They aren't worth the trouble. I have something much more interesting to look further into. The Venlil may not be as useless as we thought." His eyes met mine across the clearing. Trembling, I finally lowered the gun. The Arxer's eyes narrowed as he laughed, his throat clicking and vibrating. "There really are no prey on this planet." He grabbed the rope tightly as he and his soldiers ascended back to the shuttle. The ships ascended back into Earth's blue skies and disappeared. Grant walked up beside me. I barely noticed him. He lifted my paw, still curled tight around the sidearm. Fighting to slow my breathing down, I looked over at him. "What are you doing?" He looked at me and smirked. He held up a loaded magazine and turned the gun in my hand to reveal that it was empty. He racked the slide and forced my paw into the trigger. Nothing but a metallic click and a brief, silvery ring followed. My eyes went wide. Grant simply laughed and pressed the pistol into my chest. "Time to go home, honey badger." I crossed a frosted field toward a large, white barn. Large UN helicopters roared behind me as they came in to land at the small airfield near Hamilton and begin the evacuation. I walked on a crutch the hospital gave me, designed for human children. As I approached the tall pair of doors, I heard a melodic sound humming from inside. Warm, metallic strums filled the air with a lively yet oddly calming rhythm. I peeked into the slightly open door and saw Hugh sitting on a box with an instrument lying over his lap. He strummed at it softly while he quietly mumbled a melody. I didn't catch many of the lyrics, but the last line I heard was, "I'm on my long journey home." Lucky was lying on the ground a few feet from him, her head resting on her paws as she seemed to listen. I took a deep breath and opened the door. Hugh stopped playing, and Lucky shot up. I shut the door behind me and stood there, propped up on my crutch. Lucky approached as though she might pounce on me again but stopped a few steps away. Hugh set his instrument beside him and stared at me, concern creasing over his face. I let out a breath and looked down at Lucky. She approached somewhat cautiously and sniffed me a few times. She smelled the bandages around my leg before she sat down and let out a soft whine that grew into a quiet bark. I snickered. "I'm okay." I rested a paw on her head. Her fur was so much softer than I remembered. I looked over at Hugh. "That was beautiful." "What is that?" "That was $2 bill. Old folk song." Hugh grunted. "Oh. I was talking about the instrument." "Oh, this? That's a guitar. Sorry, sometimes I forget you folk ain't from here." He chuckled before sighing. "Yeah, the pup seems to like it." It was nice. I looked down at Lucky as the silence began to overtake the barn. The crackling flame in the stove became the dominant sound. The structure groaned and creaked as the wind outside continued howling. Lucky whined and shuffled uneasily. I stroked her head. "It's okay," I whispered. I realized I was talking to her the way the humans did. Somehow, I felt like she could understand. Hugh continued staring at me. "You know, I don't think it's physical wounds she's worried about." His blue eyes creased as they gazed into mine. "What happened?" I shifted. "Well, we did it. That's why the evacuation is happening now. You can finally get out of here." Hugh leaned forward, weaving his fingers together. "And?" I looked down at Lucky and scratched the fur around my neck. "And, my throat felt like it was closing up. It didn't go like we planned, My vision started to become blurry. Lucky stood up as my voice began to quiver. I couldn't do it anymore." I looked away and put a paw over my mouth before collapsing against the door and slumping down, my crutch clattering to the ground. Lucky nudged her way into my chest, and I grabbed her tight without a second thought, sobbing into the fur around her neck. Fear didn't even seem to be a factor. Lucky flinched at my sudden grasp but didn't move. I felt Hugh's hand on my shoulder as he knelt beside me. "It's all right, you don't have to say nothing, Dot," he said softly. "Why don't you just stay here a while?"